Hi, I'm Sean Oss. I'm a senior research scholar here at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Welcome to my talk on disability, health, and the aims of medicine. So I have a few goals here today. The overarching theme is to think about some issues in theoretical bioethics, right? So some kind of abstract issues, especially about the concept of health. But I distinctively do that using concepts from disability scholarship and activism. And so in particular, we're going to think about the social model of disability, and how that can help us think about what the goals of medicine and health policy should be, right? If we think about the goal of medicine and public health as being the promotion in some sense of health, it's important to understand what health is, and how the relationship between the way a person's body works and the way their society accommodates that body does and doesn't affect their health status. Okay, so I want to start with the following question. This is Tatjana McFadden. Tatjana McFadden, I believe this is from 2014, at least the time on the slide. Tatjana McFadden ran a marathon in 1 hour, 45 minutes, and 12 seconds, right? She used a wheelchair to do it, but still a full-length marathon in an incredible time, faster than anyone's ever run a marathon on 2 feet. So this raises the question, is Tatjana McFadden healthy, right? I couldn't run a marathon at all, much less in less than 2 hours. I couldn't, power through a marathon in a wheelchair in less than 2 hours. It's just not something I could do, right? So there's some sense in which some people who have disabilities, right? In Tatjana McFadden's case, I believe she has spina bifida. Certainly relies on a wheelchair in her daily life as well. Some people with disabilities seem to be have very kind of healthy bodies. They seem to be able to do all kinds of things. They seem to be very robust and fit, right? And so the kind of guiding question for the talk is, what's the conceptual relationship between disability and health? Can you have a disability but still be healthy? So to think about this, it'll be helpful to draw on some definitions, right? So if we want to answer that question, we need to think about what's disability and what's health. So in the context of discussions of disability, increasingly prominent and I think now dominant model, including in the law, what's come to be called the social model of disability. So the social model of disability basically says that the problems that people have from disability are sometimes to some very significant extent a result of the way their society fits their body instead of the way the body is in itself. So to make this idea clear, proponents of a social model of disability who influenced policy and legislation, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, actually a conceptual distinction between a disability, properly speaking, and an impairment, right? So these are the actual definitions from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or it's a record of being impaired, or it's being regarded as impaired. Whereas, right, so that defines disability in terms of impairments, and then impairment is any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss, or mental or psychological disorder, right? So the idea is that basically is that the impairment is the bodily difference, the disease or disorder. The disability is the social consequences of that, or something close to it. So if this is what a disability is, then, right, using this legal definition, which isn't necessarily the right definition, but it's a useful one to start with, since it's one that we're required to use in certain contexts, is a disability necessarily a health problem, right? Well, one set of cases where we can, I think, fairly quickly see that the answer is no, is cases where people have conditions which other people think about as impairments, but which maybe aren't, right, or at least arguably aren't. So this rainbow infinity sign has come to be accepted as a symbol of what's called the Neurodiversity Movement. Some of you may be familiar with the Neurodiversity Movement. Neurodiversity, as the term is typically used, although not only, but it's typically used by people who might be diagnosed by others as on the autism spectrum. It's typically used as a self-identifier for people who might have received autism diagnoses who don't see themselves as sick. They just see themselves as diverse or different, right? So suppose, and you might agree with some or all of these people, or you might not, but suppose that some people who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum disorder don't have an actual disease or disorder, right? That psychiatric condition is overdiagnosed, that some people are included in the category of autism spectrum or other categories like, for instance, ADHD, and they really don't have anything that we should call think of from a scientific perspective as a disorder, but rather only a condition which is perceived or regarded as a disorder. There's an interesting question. It's an interesting question for disability activism and scholarship, as well as a theoretical question of bioethics and the definition of health and disability. So could somebody who doesn't actually have any impairment or bodily or mental problem at all, could that person still be disabled? Well, according to the ADA, the answer is very clearly yes, right? Because although disability is defined in terms of impairment, it's defined disjunctively as either having an impairment which limits a major life activity or having other people think that you have an impairment, right? Having a record or being regarded as impaired, right? So some people are disabled even though they are no different, or at least not different in a way that constitutes a disease or disorder from other people's bodies, right? They're disabled just because people see them as having a disease or disorder. And so who exactly that includes is going to be partly a scientific medical question, because it's going to depend on what we should think really is a disease or disorder. But at least if we think about disability in the way the social model would have us think about disability, at least as that's represented in the Americans with Disabilities Act, we should be willing to admit that some people could be disabled but perfectly healthy because their disability has nothing to do with any problem in their body, right? It's a problem with the way society responds to their body. Now, some people think of the social model of disability as trying to say that all disabilities are like that, right? That every body is the same. There's no such thing as a problem with the body, and there's only ever a problem with how society responds to that body. I think that that's possibly not a reasonable view. I think that there is such a thing as physiological disorders, conditions, anatomical loss, mental and psychological disorders, possibly, certainly at the very least, physiological disorders, and that these can have a major impact on people's lives. So that some people who are disabled also genuinely have impairments, right? It's not merely being disabled isn't merely a matter of how society sees you. Sometimes it can also be a matter of how your body actually is. That you have some problem with your body. And our paradigm example of a disabled person that we might want to think of as healthy is actually not going to be healthy in the same way that a neurodiverse person could be healthy, right? A neurodiverse person just doesn't have any problem with their body or mind. Whereas Tatiana McFadden does have a problem with her body, right? Any physician or pathologist would regard as a disease or disorder, right? It would be in any classification of diseases, Spina Bifida, and the resulting inability to ambulate on two legs, right? That's going to be a health or an impairment that is a physiological disorder in any reasonable definition thereof. So that doesn't yet settle the question of whether Tatiana can be healthy or not, right? Because we don't know what health is. So to try to make some progress on this, I want to take you through a few of the more prominent philosophical ways of thinking about health and use them as kind of criteria or tests to see how we can think about whether disabled people with impairments, people like Tatiana McFadden, can still be healthy in spite of their impairments. And thinking about this case, and we'll kind of work back and forth and use this case as a way of thinking about the theories, right? This and related cases, right? So we'll both use theory to shed light on practice and practice to shed light on theory, right? Which seems like the right way to go in bioethics when you're touching on theory. Okay, so the first theory of health that I'll consider, perhaps the most well-known philosophical theory of health, is due to a philosopher named Christopher Borse. He puts it in philosopher ease in the following way. Health in a member of the reference class is normal functional ability, the readiness of each internal part to perform all its normal functions on typical occasions with at least typical efficiency. Okay, so to understand this definition, we'd have to understand a lot of the several of the terms in it, especially normal functional ability and the reference class, right? So we don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this and explain these terms with full philosophical rigor. But the basic idea, I think, could be illustrated by reference to an example, right? So the idea is the following, right? The body of a human organism, like the body of any organism, kind of plan, right? It has parts which are supposed to do certain things, not in the sense that they were, intentionally created to do those things necessarily, although maybe they were. Not even in the sense that for Boris, that they evolved to do those things, but in the sense that in most people, these parts do certain kinds of things to contribute to survival and reproduction, right? So just like in most cars, well, in the reference class, right? In most manual cars, the clutch contributes a certain plays a certain role in making the car go, right? Namely, allowing the gears to shift. So we said that the function of the clutch is to help you shift the gears, because that's what the clutch does in most cars, to help the car go, right? So the idea on this kind of view of health is that we can break the human body down into that kind of functional hierarchy. We can pick out for each part something that it is, as it were, supposed to do, right? I say as it were because it's only supposed to do it in the sense that that's the thing that it normally or typically does in most members of the human species. Okay, so to illustrate Boris's view, it might be helpful to think of an example, right? So why is it that we think of, say, the function of the kidney or the parts of the kidney as filtering blood, right? What does that mean, right? What is it to think that for the kidney to function normally is for it to filter blood at a certain kind of rate, for the parts of the kidney to, like the nephron here, to function normally is for them to do certain other more specific tasks at a certain rate. For Boris, the idea is just that that there's a kind of statistical regularity when we look at the human body, right? That the kidney does certain, kidneys in most people and nephrons as parts of kidneys do certain things at certain rates. Typically, those things contribute to the survival and reproduction of those organisms. A kidney is healthy, a nephron is healthy if it does that thing, the thing the kidney normally or usually does, at least an average level of efficiency for the human species, right? No worse than the typical nephron or kidney or endocrine system, right? So the idea is then that a healthy person as a whole is someone all of whose parts are healthy in this sense, right? So you kind of build health from the bottom up conceptually, right? From the parts to the whole. A healthy whole is a system all of whose parts are working at least at average levels of efficiency. Okay, so if this is what health is, we can then ask, can people like Tatiana McFadden, people with impairments like Spina Bifida, can those people be healthy on this view? We already saw that people who are disabled but don't have impairments, like perhaps some neurodiverse people, those people can be healthy. But should we say the same about people who really do have impairments, right? Like Spina Bifida. And it looks like if we were to agree with Boris about what health is, right, with this kind of coolly scientific view of health, this view that doesn't require any value judgments at all, it seems like the answer would have to be no, right? So I'm not, again, a physician, so I couldn't tell you exactly what the pathophysiology of spina bifida is, but there's some difficulty in people with spina bifida in transmitting nerve signals to the lower body, right? So the relevant neural structures normally, right, typically in the average human being are fairly good at transmitting signals from the brain to the legs. In someone who has significant spina bifida or the I suppose neurological consequences thereof. Again, not a physician, not quite sure how it works. But someone with that impairment is going to have a part of their body which isn't working as well as it tends to work in other people, right? It isn't doing what it normally does, right? It just isn't doing the kind of thing that it does in most other people, and in that sense, they couldn't be healthy, right? But as the philosopher says, potentially one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, right? So we know that Boris's view of health says that someone with impairments can't be fully healthy. Should we take that as a reason to think that people with impairments can't be fully healthy, or as a reason to move to a different view of health? So I think in any case, we should probably move to a different view of health, right? So this is because there are a couple of well-known, long-standing problems with Bors's sort of naturalistic view of health. So the first is that it generates certain false positives. So the view says that you're healthy if all your parts work as well as they work in the normal person of your, turns out, of your gender and age, right? But people have long noticed that there are certain diseases which most people, or at least most people at a given age, have, right? So most people at any age have some degree of dental caries or cavities. Certainly over human history, that's been true. And most older people have some degree of arthrosclerosis, right? But those are still diseases. You're still healthier if you don't have cavities or if you don't have arthrosclerosis than if you do. And so it seems like this view says that some people who are healthy who seem to us not to be, right? So it's an independent problem with the view. More sensitive and I think potentially challenging problem for the view it involves certain false negatives, right? So it's long been recognized. It's been recognized now for probably getting reasonably close to another 50-year anniversary. That people aren't that same-sex orientation is no kind of health problem, right? People with same-sex orientation are not any less healthy as a result of that, right? Just as a result of having same-sex orientation, right? But yet, remember, Bors says that that if some part, and here he wants to include parts in terms of mental systems, right, as well as physical systems, if something about you makes you less likely, right? If some part of yours doesn't make the kind of contribution to survival and reproduction that such parts normally that is typically statistically typically make in other members of the human species, then you have a health problem according to Bors, right? So it looks like the sex drive or some related set of dispositions in our minds and brains in the statistically typical human being, in most human beings, make it likely that they'll reproduce sexually, right? Whereas if you have same-sex orientation, your sex drive makes it less likely that you'll reproduce sexually. And that seems to make it hard to understand how or why it would be that same-sex orientation is not a health problem, right? It looks like this view, this normal functioning view, that is statistically typical functioning view, implies falsely, and I would add offensively, that same-sex orientation is a health problem. So that seems like a reason. Both of these together seem like a reason not to think about health in this way. Certainly not for purposes of bioethics, at least, right? So if we don't need to think of health the way that Bors would have us think of it, then we don't need to conclude from analysis of Bors's theory that people like Tatjana McFadden, people with impairments and disabilities, that those people can't be healthy, right? We need to look to a more plausible theory of health to answer that question. Thinking about the nature of these kinds of problems for Bors's theory, I think points us in the direction of potentially more plausible theories of health that might be more helpful for this example. So it seems like the reason why we would want to say that arthrosclerosis is a health problem, even though it's typical, or that same-sex orientation is not a health problem, even though it's not typical, right? Is that typicality isn't the only thing that matters, right? Another thing that seems to matter in our judgments about health is whether something is good or bad, right? So arthrosclerosis is bad for you, right? Same-sex orientation isn't in itself bad for you, right? Because arthrosclerosis is bad for you, we're more inclined to call it a disease or health problem, whereas because same-sex orientation isn't, we're less inclined to do so, right? So that leads to a conjecture. This is a theoretical conjecture of mine, right? Though one that many other people agree with, that health is an evaluative term, right? So whether it's correct to call someone healthy or unhealthy depends on the value of their health state or the state of their body, not just on how the state of that body compares statistically to other bodies that exist now or have existed before. So as I said, this is not a novel conjecture of mine, right? Though it is a conjecture of mine. Other philosophers have developed theories of health which make health evaluative in this way, right? So one famous definition of health that you may be familiar with is a definition of the WHO, who say that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, this is a lofty ideal for public health and medical practice, that we should attend to every aspect of the patient or the citizen's life in doing healthcare, but it doesn't seem to be literally true as a claim about health, right? So my well-being would be better if I could be in the room with all of you giving this talk. That would make me happier. But the fact that I have to deliver it through Zoom, with all the frustrations that can come with that, doesn't make me any less healthy, right? So it means I'm not in a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. But the problem just isn't the right kind of problem to be a health problem, right? I'm in a state of better well-being after I eat than when I'm a bit hungry, but as long as I'm not starving, my being hungry isn't a health problem, right? So we shouldn't take this WHO claim literally, however inspirational it may be as an ideal. If we want to define health in terms of a kind of valuable or good state, we need to be a bit more specific about what kind of valuable or good state it is. So philosophers have tried to do that. For instance, the philosopher Leonard Nordenfelt defends a theory on which that is, somebody is completely healthy if and only if they have the ability, given standard circumstances, to reach all of their vital goals, right? So a person's vital goals are those things that she has to be able to achieve if she's going to be able to have a decent life by her own lights, right? So in my case, my inability to deliver the lecture to you in person, right? My having to deal with Skype, Zoom, etc. That's a problem with my achieving my goals, namely, goals of delivering a smooth and enjoyable lecture. But it's not a interference with my vital goals, right? I don't think this. I don't think that the frustrations of the pandemic have ruined my life, right? So the idea is we're making this evaluative aspect of health a bit more specific. Okay, so we can ask, as we did for Bors's view, whether people with impairments can be healthy on this view. And it seems like, again, the answer is yes, right? Or sorry, not again. By contrast, the answer is yes, right? So Tatiana McFadden, though she clearly has an impairment in the ADA sense, seems to be thriving. She seems to be accomplishing all the things she wants to accomplish, and she seems to be healthy. Okay, so have we solved the problem, right? Have we found a way of talking about health which is philosophically tenable and respectful of people with disabilities, right? I'm not sure that we have, because I think that while this view is admirably inclusive in allowing people to be healthy so long as they can accomplish what they want to accomplish, whatever else other people think they should be able to do, I think in the end, the idea that whether we're healthy or not is determined solely by our own goals is problematic, right? So this picture represents one such problem. We could call it a problem of false negatives. That is, people who Nordenfelt's theory will say are unhealthy, even though they are in fact healthy. Right. So this is a picture of someone getting ready to climb Annapurna, believed to be or held to be one of the most difficult mountains to climb in the world. Right. Much more difficult than Everest. They can't just, you can't just hire a Sherpa to kind of drag you up. You have to really be an excellent climber. So I will never in my life be able to climb Everest, or maybe ever. Certainly not Annapurna. But if I really became so obsessed with climbing that I felt that my life was significantly worsened by the fact that I couldn't climb Annapurna, that I couldn't achieve my vital goals. That wouldn't make me in and of itself. That wouldn't mean that I was unhealthy. Now, if I developed depression or something like that as a result, maybe it would, right? But I think the idea, which can initially seem appealing, that we're healthy if we have bodies that allow us to do all the things that we really need or want to be able to do, I think it's ultimately not going to work, because it makes whether we're healthy or not too sensitive to what our particular goals happen to be, right? If our goals place enormous demands on our body, then all of a sudden, we could try and get our health insurance to pay for our blood doping or advanced training to be able to accomplish amazing athletic feats, right? And and on the other side, if someone sinks, into a state of apathy and doesn't want to do anything at all, then they might not be unhealthy, even if they can't get off the couch if they just don't want to get off the couch. And I think again, we don't want to make people's actual health so dependent on what they happen to want as that would, right? Okay, so this leads to another conjecture, right? So from thinking about a definition of health, Bohr says, which tried to do without any evaluative notion altogether, which tried to make health just a matter of typicality, we came to the realization that there may be some reason to think that whether you have a health problem or not depends on certain values or goals of yours, right? On that when we think that you're healthy or unhealthy, we're not just making a factual judgment, we're making an evaluative judgment. But then reflection on both the WHO view and Leonard Nordenfeld's view, on which being healthy is a matter of being able to do everything you want to be able to you really want to be able to do. That seems to make health too demanding, right? It seems to make it too difficult to be healthy, right? Too easy to be unhealthy just because you can't do something that you really want to do, right? So a conjecture about where we should go in our thinking about health from here would be to say that whether it's correct to call somebody unhealthy depends on whether their health state is really a problem for them, right? Whether it harms them, right? So we would say, I'm not harmed by my inability to climb high mountains, right? That's not really a problem for me that other people need to pay attention to. It's falling short of what I might most want, but it's not really harming me or making me badly off. So the philosopher Wakefield defines health in terms of harm, right? So Wakefield says health is the absence of disorder, where a condition is a disorder if and only if the condition causes some harm and the condition results from the inability of some internal mechanism to perform its natural function. So this is actually a bit like Christopher Bors's view. It says that to be unhealthy, you have to have some problem with your body. But he disagrees with Borson, saying that the problem with your body, the atypical functioning, right, the thing that is working less well than it would normally work, that has to actually be a problem in the broader sense that it makes your life harder, right? That it causes some harm to you, where we understand harm not as relative to complete well-being or to what you think you should be able to get, but relative to some more objective standard of what kinds of things people should be able to do with their bodies. So we should ask again, can people, we have this new view of health on the table, can people with impairments be healthy on this view? And it looks like the answer is yes, right? So if a disabled person is well accommodated, their impairment doesn't necessarily produce any harms in their life, right? So, I don't know whether that's how Tachana McFadden feels about her impairment or the gentleman in this photo, but certainly there are social measures we can take. And of course, this is a major impetus of disability activism to take more of these measures to make it the case that bodily differences, right, that atypical functioning doesn't cause a harm in your life, right? So it does look like that like this view would imply, right? This view that ill health is harmful dysfunction, right? That health is not having harmful dysfunctions, that people with impairments can be healthy. I still don't think though that this solves the entire problem, right? So I still think we don't have a theory of health which orients us correctly to thinking about health in the context of disability. And that's probably because this view produces certain false negatives, right? So some people, I think, are harmed by bodily dysfunction only because of unjust social responses to that function. And yet these people are nonetheless healthy, right? So let me give you a kind of a simple example, right? So suppose, for the sake of argument, that my androgenic alopecia, which maybe you can see, maybe you can't, I don't know if the background obscures it, but my male pattern baldness, suppose that is some kind of impairment, right? That's a real dysfunction. It's in the normal human male, I think still in the statistically normal human male, the follicles produce hair even at my middling age. Suppose that were true. If I were disadvantaged by my baldness because, say, people in my society were mean to bald people, right, that wouldn't make me unhealthy, right? That would be a social problem, but not a health problem, right? Because there's nothing sort of intrinsic to the way a body is supposed to work or to baldness in itself, which is harmful, right? A condition which is only harmful because of a adverse social response to it, it seems like is not a health problem. Okay, so what do we take from all this? I hope you found that a kind of interesting tour of philosophical theories of health and how they orient us to thinking about disability. Well, I think we can take two conjectures from this, right? So one conjecture, I think, is that health is an evaluative concept, as we said, right? Whether it's correct to call someone unhealthy depends on whether their health state is a problem for them. So as I said, that's a kind of philosophical commonplace. But I've tried to talk you through some reasons here to accept another idea about health, right? About the way in which health is evaluative. And that's to say that health is about the state of the body, right? You can't become more or less healthy unless something changes in your body itself, right? You can't be unhealthy simply because of how society treats you. It has to be because of something about your body, right? And so there's a big theoretical question, which I'm working on but don't know how to answer, as to what it has to be about your body that isn't, what has to change in your body to change your health, right? What does it mean for something to be intrinsically harmful as opposed to extrinsically harmful? So I don't know how to answer that question, but I think it has a great deal of significance for important issues in bioethics, and especially for the aims of medicine and public health. So I think these two conjectures have two consequences, which can usefully orient us in our philosophical thinking. So one is that once we see that health is evaluative, we'll see that decisions about what will promote either patient or population health depend on judgments about what sorts of functioning people ought to have access to. Right. So when we make the judgment that something is a health condition, right, that something is a health problem, we're making an evaluative judgment about it being a problem in their life. Right. But what I want to point to, right, I think people have recognized that. What I want to point to is something else, which I think reflection on the social model of disability and the idea that someone who is disadvantaged solely by a social response to their bodily difference and not by the difference itself, that when we think about something as a health problem, properly speaking, right, is really a health problem, not a social problem, but a health problem. We're not just saying that their body creates problems for them, right, in conjunction with society. We're saying there's something about the body itself which is creating the problem, right? Maybe that there's something about the body that conduces to pain or suffering or something that's kind of bad in itself, or premature death, if that's something that's bad in itself. So my hope is that these philosophical reflections theoretical reflections can help to orient us in our more practical thinking about what the health system and its different parts should be aiming at. But there's a lot more, both theoretical and practical, reflection that will be required to reach that kind of useful practical endpoint. But I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for listening. Bye.